Welcome to Elevation Live. I'm Kevin Barron. In this episode, we are diving into the decade of global sport. But are we ready for what's coming? Between the World Cup, Olympics, and a slate of leagues with expanding international footprints, there are more people than ever crossing more borders with more frequency, all for the purpose of sport and culture and the $500 billion of estimated market value within. It's a complex world to navigate as it is, but suddenly there's a new challenge for nations, teams, and sponsors to navigate: the war in Iran. Enter Travis Murphy and his firm Jetr Global, a one-of-one venture that operates at the intersection of sports, immigration, business, policy, and diplomacy. We'll discuss the realities facing these international events, leagues, athletes, and sponsors, and how to ensure the games go on. That's worth elevating. Hi, Travis. How are you?
I'm great, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining me, for us. I'm glad to get you here. We've been talking about this for a while, haven't we?
We have been. It's great to finally connect.
Well, tell people a little bit about yourself. I know you as the sport diplomacy guy, but you've got quite a career. You were a diplomat. You worked for an MBA. You now have your own firm. That's this interesting kind of hybrid of things that you do. So give us the quick version here.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, so let me start off with the present, which is CEO, founder of, as you said, Jetr Global Sports and Entertainment. We are a consultancy that sits based here in Washington, D.C., that sits at this intersection of sports and policy, global movement, getting the people where they need to go to participate in sporting events and entertainment products, but also trying to elevate the conversation around this space and trying to look beyond the spectacle of sports and entertainment and really see it for the true cultural export, but also powerful convener that it is. And I know we'll talk about that today. In terms of my background, I'm a kid from the Midwest, came out to Washington to work for my home state congressman too many years ago, and then wanted to get more of a taste of the international side of things. And so was fortunate enough to go through the various steps of getting into the foreign service, became a diplomat, and worked overseas for close to a decade, primarily in South America and West Africa. My last tour in the foreign service was in the Department of Sports Diplomacy at the State Department, the Division of Sports Diplomacy, which ostensibly is a programmatic office in that it facilitates exchanges, because the United States is one of the few countries in the world that has no Ministry of Sports. We have no federal level body that really oversees the larger sports space, which, as long as we have the NFL and the NBA operating privately, individually as standalone leagues, that's fine. Where we're starting to see now, yeah, it is. But now where we're starting to see these friction points is the fact that, to your point, we're welcoming the world through the events that have happened and those to come over the course of the next decade. We're going to be hosting hundreds of millions of people for global sporting events. And the reality is our systems are simply not ready. So then, just to finish that out, after the sports diplomacy division in the State Department, I had the good fortune to go to the NBA, where I helped oversee international government affairs at a time when the league was just booming internationally in terms of launching their academy program, more games overseas. As some of your listeners may be aware, the last 7 MVPs of the NBA have all been international, and that really was the time I was there. So they have become the gold standard for international expansion for a domestic league. But that brings us to the present, which is both that domestic leagues are expanding internationally and we have these events coming in, and we as a country need to be looking at sports differently.
Yeah, I forgot that the reason I found you, our link, was General Dempsey, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who I covered for many years at the Pentagon. And I saw some post on LinkedIn of you and, good job, General, with this thing with sport. I went, oh, right, I forgot Dempsey was the chairman of USA Basketball after he left, right?
That's right. An advisor to NBA Commissioner Adam Silver. So I met General Dempsey through that, and he's become as he is for many people, a mentor, a family friend, but remains in the position of chairman of USA Basketball.
So here we are. For those of you watching, Travis and I have had a lot of conversations over the year, and you've been very helpful for me to learn about the world of global sport. Coming at it, journalistically through the lens of national security and global partnerships, but also kind of maybe like as you said, as a kid of the '80s who grew up with the Olympics and other big events, things like Live Aid behind me. These are global cultural moments that attracted me to a world of international, policy and that kind of a life. And so this is kind of coming full circle here.
Well, and one of the major inflection points for people of our generation is the Dream Team in 1992, right? The first time that NBA players were allowed to participate in the Olympics, and what that did, going back to the NBA piece, just to really, I think for the NBA to realize, oh, we have a global audience already. People know our players.
I really put it at the '84 games of me. That's my earliest memory of the politics of it, of the Soviets boycotting. And I don't think I knew right away or until later that was in response to the Americans boycotting their earlier games.
In '80.
And so between that era and the, USA hockey, the Miracle on Ice, that kind of whole, I always had this sense of, these are inherently political things. These are inherently about the way the world really is. These aren't just games that exist in a vacuum. And so, I wanted to set up that you and I have talked in this last year. I think we were both trying to navigate the unexpected Trump administration and how the U.S. has changed right at the precipice of what's been called this global decade of sport coming to the United States, of these big events, right? And for the people watching, we said the World Cup this year, the biggest ones, the World Cup this year, the LA 28 Summer Games, the 2034 Salt Lake Winter Games, and a lot of in between, plus the expansion, like you said, of like NBA, NFL, becoming more global, people coming in through MLS, sailing, tennis, golf, all of it. There's something going on where I feel global sports is really exploding, especially here in the United States, in a new way. At the same time, we had this administration come in and kind of frankly politics around the world that have become more isolationist, more protectionist. And so you navigate this, or you help clients and you help people understand this and figure it out. And then war happens. This is a lot. This is a lot coming at you. Tell me, maybe my first thing is when the war on Iran started, when these attacks started, we're only a couple weeks into it, for those who were watching us maybe in the future. What's the response in the global sports community, in your world? What are the things that you start hearing and people start chattering about when suddenly, especially in the Gulf, which is so central to global sports for lots of reasons, what was the reaction?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Going back to the Olympics, it's a good point that we boycotted in '80, the Soviets, and then a number of their allies boycotted LA '84. And so, sports, and then, when you talk about kind of the genesis of sports diplomacy, there's a number of inflection points, some of which we've mentioned. There's like the ping pong diplomacy from the early 1970s. There is going back to, the Yankees, like the Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig Yankees went to Japan and played exhibition matches back in the late 1920s. So I say that to, that the sports and kind of our relationship with other countries has always been a theme, but we've always referred to that as soft power. And I hate that term. I think that's such a misnomer for the modern global sports infrastructure. And I think to your question, Kevin, you have to look no more than the existing circumstances in which the host of the biggest World Cup, not just that, the largest sporting event in history, this summer's World Cup in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, the primary host of 78 of those 104 matches just invaded one of the participants and killed their leader. It's so unprecedented in kind of, of these many events in the past where sports and geopolitics kind of collided. And I think a couple of things there. One, most importantly, it really demonstrates how sports is such a fundamental aspect of geopolitics. It's not a nice to have. It's not soft. It's not an afterthought. Whether it's Brittany Griner being detained in Russia for 10 months and Russia kind of using her as a pawn as they were invading Ukraine, or, what we're looking at now, not just with, the Iran and the World Cup, but you have the Venezuelan team that had a number of people denied visas that weren't able to play in the World Baseball Classic, right? And so we have this, obviously, an unprecedented, we're overusing this word, I think, culturally in the United States about the current political environment. But for lack of better
Right, it's
vocabulary,
not
the
all unprecedented.
unprecedented.
Yeah, it's not all. There is precedent. It's a heightened
There is
version
some
of precedent.
precedent, but I think kind of the aggressiveness with which we're approaching, our engagement around the world is a bit of whiplash for people. And inevitably, like you said, it's this collision of the moment where we have a real opportunity to leverage sports to our advantage as a country, with a far more aggressive posture where we're now the president has just now said that he doesn't think Iran should participate. So essentially, effectively has kicked them out of the tournament. There is no precedent for that. And so how we navigate that, I think, is you're really talking about how we approach not just this global decade of sports, but kind of the growing role, or the role that now exists, that sports plays in society, and then how we kind of handle this administration over the course of the next 3 years, and the events that we have coming, which, as you mentioned, are the World Cup and then the Olympics in 28. But in 2027 is the World Military Games coming to the United States for the first time. And that's ostensibly military members from China, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, other countries that have historically participated in this event.
Are they going to come to that? Wait, we're letting them in for those games?
Well, many questions yet to come, to be answered, to see. But my point there is that sports is now inextricably linked to kind of our posture and how we approach foreign policy and engagement with countries around the world.
Yeah, look, I tell people, I think it was always a myth, that they shut up and play. It just depends on the person, it depends on the athlete, it depends on the team, the league, whatever, how much they want to be activists in politics. But that, whether you want to or not, you got to navigate the real world. And the way that sports has become so global, the way that I see it is, I will say, you've got leagues, teams, athletes, and sponsors who all have to align.
Right.
into certain parameters, whether it be the values of Olympism and the games that go on there, to whatever FIFA World Cup is, how they're promoting themselves. And that's increasingly conflicting with, it's conflicting with some politics of some nations, in ways where, in the past, it's easy to say, we stay out of politics and just do business, but it's side by side. When you had, we just had the Winter Olympics, and there are teenagers and 20-year-olds just without flinching, really criticizing the administration for things like, ICE policies in the streets when Minnesota was happening, or whatever it might be. So is that something you see? I guess let's talk about trends. Like, you've been doing this for a while, and when you have, your clients coming in now or who have been at this for a while, is it wrong to think that we're in a new era that, actually companies and athletes, they're more interested in being activists or having values or making this part of their identity, navigating that with the real world, not just being completely out of it and just being I don't know what the word is, a politics less brand?
Right. I think at this point in time, it's really difficult to be apolitical in today's world. And this isn't, necessarily a function of the Trump administration, but more kind of how we consume media, how we consume news, how we share information. All of that has evolved, and politics has become kind of where we live. Like, this is like, we choose our sides and we choose to engage. And, in terms of activism, I think that it's going to look differently in the modern era. And it does seem like a lot of this is being, I don't want to say blown out of proportion, but like, it's just so immediate now, right? And so, one of the athletes making kind of a passing comment in Milan, as you referenced, like, yeah, a lot of stuff that's going on in the United States isn't that great right now. Immediately, you have the president of the United States who's sending a tweet essentially in response to that. And so, our role and kind of the work that we're doing at Jetr Global is, we're not a comms agency, but we're trying to help navigate that and advocate for thinking ahead, right? It's, yes, we can put out the fire, but we'd much rather be a smoke detector and kind of look at the landscape of kind of the operations, logistics, like how do we get the athletes, the teams from A to B to get them where they need to be. But also then once, as you're working through these processes, helping prepare, because whether they like it or not, every athlete is a diplomat, right? They are, what they are saying is going to be elevated, amplified on a global stage. And so having that awareness, understanding that, not just to like, don't say that, but rather just recognize that the voice that you have, that the weight that it carries and what you say, I think, helping them to realize how empowered they are. And, will we see that passion come out in the World Cup and the Olympics and these other events? I think absolutely we will. We saw it in Qatar, right? And, kind of that push and pull of what people were trying to advocate for LGBT issues or, other issues. And then Qatar kind of pushing back against that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well,
and so, I think that in the way that, sorry to interrupt, but just like, I think in the way that now, my point being that sports is inextricably a part of geopolitics, as a result, it will be a launching pad for protest. It will be seen because it is such an effective method of getting messages, whether it's protest, support, having that on an international, having that message spread internationally, because it's the virility around global sporting events is so effective, and we're going to see a lot more of that.
Well, think about those big events that are coming. In the last year, I think since Trump came in, there have been all these different headlines and moments where people thought Trump said something or a new policy is enacted, and therefore the World Cup's not going to happen, or he's going to move the games out of Democrat states to Republican states, or international, there's a travel ban on several countries, and there are players and teams in those countries that have to work their way in. I know you guys you're probably helping with that kind of work and immigration as well. Do you believe that those kind of sweeping headlines, or do you think the World Cup is going to happen? Like the White House wants these events to happen. We got to get there from here, but
yeah.
Do you think the World Cup is going to get canceled? Do you think it's going to get moved, or is that's just a little bit over worry, overhype?
If you think back to just talking about the World Cup, like the World Cup in 2022 in Qatar, there was headline after headline. And there were, by all accounts, pretty horrific violations of human rights for foreign non-Qatari workers that were there working on building the stadiums in really difficult conditions under unreasonable timelines. And there was talks of boycotts. There was attempts to, kind of stage protests on the field, some successful, some not. But this idea, so I think there's a fair amount of pearl clutching that inevitably happens in the lead up to these events, because people are interested and we're looking for, for no disrespect to your profession of journalism, but clicks are important in this day and age. And so, those more sensationalist headlines
I don't disagree with you there, but Trump would say these things himself. Or he'd get asked, are you going to move the World Cup? Or I used to say, maybe we shouldn't have games in Boston because he's mad at the Boston mayor because of immigration. It's like they're just unprecedented kind of, like you said before, the president will tweet when he sees an Olympics
right.
state something. So again, how
but I think I do think that
and how this impacts it.
At the end of the day, the president has demonstrated that sports are important to him. If you look, you mentioned the travel ban. So if you look at the ban that's in place, first it initiated in June of last year, there's been some additions and then kind of a big expansion in January of this year. There is only one industry that's mentioned by name, called out in that travel ban language or visa restrictions, and that's sports. Major sporting events, Olympics, and the World Cup. When a number of different countries were added to the list at the beginning of January, we were successful in actually getting that exemption for professional sports expanded. So even more people could get in through, if they are working, have proven connections to sports. And so there's a bit of a paradox here in that the president's a sports fan. He sees the value of these events. They will move forward as a result. He would never allow them to be canceled or moved away. But at the same time, they're happening in an environment which is incredibly charged and is incredibly negative. And he obviously, whether it's, hit the level that, he kind of dictates things happening, is something we've not seen before. But I think that the kind of the goodwill isn't the right way, but there's an opportunity for us, regardless of our political environment, to really capitalize on these events and show that we can pull them off, and that we are not just the largest economy in the world. We're not now, but one of the largest economies in the world. But we are effectively the best host for international events. But we have to demonstrate that, and we're not there, right? Because we're talking about perception, we're talking about processes, and processes, still many of those remain fundamentally broken.
Well, tell me about that. Yeah, what needs to be fixed? What's broken?
So you touch on immigration. I mean, that's been a big story. There's the travel bans that we've talked about. There is, we've had this carve out, this exemption for professional sports because we want Giannis Antetokounmpo and Luka Doncic, and we want the international teams. We want the players to be able to play in the best leagues in the world, which we have here in the United States. But for the fans, for the general population, now there's a process, taking the World Cup specifically, where fans can show proof of having a ticket. And if they have that ticket, then they can get an expedited appointment. But that doesn't mean they get approved. And if they don't otherwise qualify for the visa, there's no guarantees. And so I think, there's that. There's just a lot. And the fact that the Department of State manages our embassies and consulates and does the interviews, but yet DHS and the Department of Homeland Security is the one who's greeting you at the border and kind of reevaluating your worthiness to come into the we think our systems. Right. So our systems are clunky and they don't work well together. And what we've put in place are stopgap measures to accommodate the World Cup. What we haven't done is look at fundamental changes to make this, more effective for the future.
Did that column for sports, did you guys escape the Doge threat? I know that was a worry earlier in the year was, if Doge ended up cutting State Department personnel who process visas, we're in trouble when we need to have all these big groups of visa applications coming in. Was that mitigated or is that still a concern?
It's hard to say, Kevin, because the overall visa requests are down substantially. And there's no question that tourism, empirically is down to the United States, whether that's to Canada or European countries. We're now in an inverse relationship in terms of tourist dollars. So we used to have like 15% of global tourism. We're now under 10% and the number's dropping. And so I think, you could say Doge, they escaped it, but there's other factors, other variables at play here that's probably overall driving down the number of international visitors that will come for these events.
I want to talk about sport diplomacy, like kind of the historical change. You mentioned earlier, people thought of it as maybe soft power and kitschy moments like ping pong diplomacy. But, in the modern age, I think the shining example of what's changed comes out of the Gulf states and these oil-rich, oligarchies or monarchies or whatever you want to call them that were trying to sell a different brand to the world, welcome new business, modernize their economies, modernize even societies and cultures. And in Qatar, for all their criticisms, a lot of that has been achieved. There has been a lot of progress as well. I've interviewed them as well. From your perspective, how has that changed? I guess the concept of sports diplomacy, how the United States is competing, because like you said earlier, our country doesn't have a ministry of sport. We don't have. It doesn't seem like we have the same kind of very focused and very well funded initiatives to broadcast our brand. We don't see there's Qatar Airways and Emirates stadiums everywhere around the world and every major global sport, it seems. You don't see American Airlines sponsoring in the same way, in the other direction, right?
Right.
So, where's the state of things now? Where do you think it's going? Why is it maybe valuable, or what are the challenges?
Yeah, so there's this concept that's kind of caught on in the last few years that's I'm sure some of the people viewing will be familiar with, and that's of sports washing, right? The idea, this was very much kind of came about around 2022 and Qatar hosting the World Cup, Saudi Arabia starting LIV Golf, and to your point, advertising and buying naming rights for sporting events around the world. Rwanda, you could add to that list as well. The Rwanda Development Board and Visit Rwanda has been.
Jersey.
That's right. Now, most recently with the LA Clippers, as well. Qataris have bought into the NBA, into Monumental Sports and the Washington Wizards, and so.
These are state-funded efforts with oil state-funded money behind them.
Right. But, this idea of sports washing, what I say is like one man's sports washing is another sports diplomacy, right? They're two sides of the same coin. It's just perception, right? And what side of this you're on. I mean, it's diplomacy. It's name recognition. And were there human rights abuses committed as a result of the World Cup, in and around the World Cup in 2022? have there been, the subjugation of women, extrajudicial killings in Saudi Arabia? Yes, these things have happened. The sports, them sponsoring a sporting event erase it? Or the fact that Cristiano Ronaldo is now playing in Saudi Arabia, does that change the fact that those things happen? No. But, my perspective, I think, is a little different than other practitioners in this space where, you look at the United States and what happened in Minneapolis, like, who's sports washing now, right? And we were this, we were hosting these events, and this was supposed to be a grand opportunity for the United States. But now, how are we utilizing sports? How is this administration utilizing sports in these coming events that are running in parallel with America 250 here in a couple of months? For as it pertains to the Middle East and these Gulf state countries, I don't think the fact that they are now recognizing they need to diversify their economies, and there's some of the way they're doing this is by sports sponsorships. What's happening in response to that is they are having to change certain ways they conduct their society and their government. There is more transparency that they have to comply with in order to sponsor an arsenal or to be engaged in U.S. sports. And so, have we fixed everything through this? No, absolutely not. Still abhorrent practices exist. But at the same time, I do think that it's a give and take. They're not just doing this and then reap all the positive benefit. They're also having to make reforms and changes that brings them more into the modern world, more in line with what Western democracies see as, important ways to run society. So there is inherent value in that. Paul Kagame in Rwanda is now, he's had to. His approach to the international space now looks different as a result of this effort to expose Rwanda to a broader audience. And so It's not all positive, but it's not all negative.
Well, for sure. And thinking about the difference between Gulf states, as an example, and maybe the United States, of how they approach sports as a diplomatic vehicle to promote something, right? Where it seems, this is very deliberate in the Gulf states. They're very deliberate in their positioning. They're very good at it. But it's also maybe easier because it's just coming from the top down. It's well funded versus in the U.S. I don't know if Visa, which has sponsored the Olympics for a million years and is sponsoring a major global sports sponsor, are they thinking of their participation in global sports as something that advances national interest or national security? The way that. And I ask this because I say here, I say all the time, the reason I'm interested in sports is because I saw so many technology companies that I know are defense contractors, and in the worlds of AI and manufacturing, the Microsofts and the Googles, I see them on the sides of Formula One cars and on the sides of the advertising boards of sport fields all around the world. And I thought the same thing. Do they realize? I'm sure these companies realize the audiences that they have, but do they approach it with the same thought that you see Gulf states, for example, do? The reason that's behind it. What would it take? Is that something that should happen? Is it possible? What would it take to get there?
To get where?
For American companies, for an American society to act in that same way, like you had said, if our shared goal is, we'd love to see a Ministry of Education just to give a higher stamp of approval and some higher level priority on the government level, but to organize and to think collectively that these global sports moments, they're more than just the games. They are, as in sport diplomacy, they're more than just diplomacy. They're about competition and advantage. They're not just VIP hospitality suites.
Well, so there's the Gulf states that we've mentioned, and they're doing it through resources, right? Because as you indicated, they have these vast sovereign wealth funds that they're able to use to fund advertising, naming rights, and they're using this to, and in some ways they're either creating sports or buying their way into sports teams too, and they see that as an investment class. They see that as building goodwill, but. If you want to look
Paris
to
Saint-Germain, right?
Yeah, exactly. But if you want to look to countries that aren't necessarily resource heavy, putting toward this and using sports as a tool for diplomacy and international relationships. There's France, Japan, Australia, Wales, Ireland, all of which have created sports diplomacy strategies that are integrated into their foreign policy. It's not as a side, it's not a soft power. It is part of the power of that country, and they're using that. They're integrating policy into what they're doing internationally. So if you talk to, the UK, and you talk, like if a US team goes overseas, so you have an MLB or an NFL team, right? The NFL is obviously in the news a lot now for sending teams overseas. They're doing more international games. There's not much of a role of the U.S. government when they do these games. This is the NFL doing this. But if you look at what, like the National Rugby League in Australia, we work with, they've done events in Las Vegas the last few years. We've helped them with that initiative. The Australian government is integrated, and they're using that to kind of to have larger conversations around trade opportunities. We've started pivoting more toward this concept of like commercial sports diplomacy. So you get away from that idea of like sports diplomacy is ping pong and soft power and like, look at us, isn't this nice? We can play sports together and now we can get along as friends. Like, no, there's actual revenue generating outcomes that come about this. And so instead of the US government kind of watching these different sports leagues expand internationally, why not be involved? Why not support them? Why not have our commerce department, which has the Foreign Commercial Service, help facilitate conversations so that when the Indianapolis Colts go to Germany, they've got a lineup of ways that they can export US goods, new potential consumers, or there's a way for German companies to have new inroads to American markets. So I think there's a lot of connection points that just aren't happening. And we're not, it's not that we're worse off for it, but we're just leaving so much on the table. And these other countries I mentioned are doing that. They demonstrate that, and they're doing this in really smart, unique ways.
Yeah, I looked up some stats of the values and the audience of some of these things, and some of the estimates I saw had the global sports industry estimated at around $600 billion annually. I think that's low, if that's a guess.
Agreed.
Others said, the NFL alone generates about $18 billion a year, which is bigger than some national economies, like just in that one sports league. Audience-wise, the World Cup audience is expected to get about 5 billion people across all of its platforms. I think 1.5 billion for finals is expected for something like that. Nothing comes close to it. The Olympics.
But think about that, Kevin. That's 20% of the world's population. And that was, we have those facts from 2022. The France versus Argentina game was that 1.5 billion people tuned in for some part of that game at a time when we've never been more fragmented as an audience and never had more content options.
Right. That's before the streaming era has really kicked in the way it has. That's So what I'm hearing, so things that you need like to grease the wheel, smooth the process, help things along, a ministry of education. What else? Like, do you need
Ministry of Sports?
Ministry of Sports. Sorry, Ministry of Sports. Or Secretary of Sports, whatever it is.
I want to hesitate to we need more government. I don't think we're going to be creating. Last time we created
I'll reframe it.
Leadership.
I'm with you. I from what I've heard in the last year, my reporting and my sourcing and my just conversations, I believe this White House wants the World Cup to succeed. They want the Olympics to succeed, and Trump wants to be the center of it. He's going to give the trophies out himself if he can. But what needs to happen to lead up to those things at the federal level, at the state level? What's your priority list?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. I don't think it's a ministry of sports, but we have to have some federal level coordination. We have to have a individual entity, a body. Maybe that's a special. We have special. Yeah, a sports czar was kind of the term that's thrown around. I don't know that.
What
Soviet terms are
presidential fitness committee, thing we've got.
We don't. We have. There's a couple of kind of disparate different entities, but we don't have. If you
want to get to the White House to talk about sports, who do you talk to? Yeah, it's a lot of people.
It's what are your inroad, right? If you're in Florida, maybe you have a connection to Marco Rubio. If you're from Ohio, maybe you have a connection to JD Vance. I'm serious. That's the way it happens now. We don't have kind of a central entry point to the U.S. government for sports, and as a result, we don't have anybody who's convening, who's coordinating at a federal level. There's now a World Cup task force, as we talked about, but that's a short-term, individual, small body that's dedicated to this one event. And, if you want to get into these thornier issues, like going back to the defense space, it's no secret that we're having trouble from a recruitment standpoint, in no small part due to obesity and the lack of physical fitness. And so, should we not be having some integration of DOW and Health and Human Services, like you mentioned, the Presidential Council on Health and Fitness. Shouldn't there be some integration across government where we're looking at opportunities to get more kids playing in sports, not competitive travel team sports, but just get kids outside? That's a national security issue. That fundamentally affects our ability to have men and women who are able to enter the armed forces, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you could look at this. And right now, we're letting the private sector run it. It's becoming more and more monetized. And we're not really addressing it in a way that recognizes that sports, physical activity is all fundamental to like our continued existence and our ability to operate in this global environment.
You think Washington gets it, other than the federal structure in the White House? I'm seeing some new events around sport diplomacy and some of the think tanks maybe just keyed up because we just had an Olympics or there's something coming. Do you think there's some momentum building?
There's lots of conversations. We certainly are trying through Jetr Global. Like part of what we're doing, we're spending time on the Hill and the interagency with the administration, and then more broadly, just advocating for just this, for a greater level of attention on the sports space. I do think there's a growing interest. We've seen some congressional action. There's a bill that's been introduced, passed out of committee in the House, and has been a counterpart's been introduced in the Senate. Sydney Kamlager-Dove out of California has been a big advocate for this space.
What is that bill? What is that bill?
And the bill would essentially call on the government to create a sports diplomacy strategy, something I've been calling for years. Like that essentially would do that. It doesn't set up a central body or individual in the government to oversee that, but it does at least try to move this forward and elevate the dialogue. So yeah, I think there's a lot of conversations, but conversation versus action, especially when it comes to kind of operating in this political environment and getting things done. I think this summer, the World Cup is going to expose a lot of cracks in the system. There's going to be no shortage of negative headlines. I certainly hope there's a lot of positive headlines too. I hope that, going back to what you were saying earlier, will this happen? This event will happen. But there's a profound difference between pulling off the event and like it happened versus maximizing the opportunity. And in talking to contacts that we have, people we work with in Mexico and Canada are co-hosts for the World Cup. I think Mexico is actually, current security situation aside, they're best positioned to maximize this opportunity. They're doing a great job of marketing Mexico to the world and their music and their food and kind of what makes Mexico unique. And they're driving tourism and encouraging people to come to Mexico. I feel like they're maximizing the amount of games that they have. Canada less so. I think they have enough turmoil and it's happening, but it's not necessarily looking at it from a perspective of like what do we do? What is this a catalyst for? And we're somewhere in between. And I think the fact that it's spread across 11 different cities, we're going to see some of these cities really leaning into this. I think what's happening in Kansas City is really impressive, and how they're going to. Well, the fact that they're really they've done a great job. They're the only host. They're the only city that is hosting 4 of the base camps for teams. So they're going to have Argentina, Netherlands, England, and Algeria are all doing their base camp in the Kansas City area.
I saw that someone said, "Ooh, we're gonna get Instagram posts of Messi with Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce now."
There you go.
There. Well, I have the same sense of everything you're saying. I wonder how much of it is just it's so based on soccer culture or football culture, right? Mexico is probably the most football, loving of the 3 countries, and in those cities, some already have because they have MLS teams or more international populations. We here in Washington are bummed that we're not hosting. There's such a soccer vibe here, and Northern Virginia is a major center for youth, soccer in the United States. Too bad, but we'll find our way to the games. I think what you said earlier, there's a difference between pulling it off and maximizing the opportunity. And I think, what do you think? I mean, maybe specific challenges. I think about sponsors, for example. Are sponsors hesitating? Do you have any sense of that? Of activating or sticking their necks out yet, or are people just not sure what to expect with literally the front page news of the day? When it comes to putting themselves attached to this mega event.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the sponsors are engaging. I mean, certainly the title sponsors that we've seen, I was boarding an American Airlines flight earlier this week and they had a big FIFA World Cup logo on the side of the American Airlines plane. So the big sponsors are participating. They're in. I think where the opportunity could be are those people who are those entities that aren't Visa, that aren't Coca-Cola, that aren't Adidas or American Airlines, maybe some foreign companies that would see this as an opportunity to kind of crack into the Americas that didn't otherwise have an opportunity to do so. I hope that continues to happen, but I think that, yeah, there probably is some reluctance, and they're having to do so much preparation for damage control, right? Like, your messaging has to be so on point, and nobody wants to become singled out by this administration, because it's not just like that. It could be like, it wouldn't be a successful advertising opportunity or sponsorship opportunity. It could devastate your business, right? Like, it could fundamentally undercut all the work you've done to build your space if the messaging for some gets crossways with a certain portion of the population. And so, yeah, I think there are those smaller entities that are probably being a little bit more cautious. And then going back to what I was saying, maybe waiting to see how the World Cup goes and looking ahead at some of these other events. It's like, okay, let's wait to kind of ride out what happens with the World Cup, see how others navigate this, where the tripwires exist, and then we can look ahead to some of these other events.
Well, we're coming near a close. I wanted to ask you about people. I mean, what you do is really at the heart of kind of people to people exchanges in that world of helping people cross borders and have partnerships that work together. And I think we forget that when we talk about the World Cup and we talk about a visa or a company or teams and national delegations. These are people making direct contact with each other in international partnerships, in cooperation. This stuff is inherently kind of anti-isolationist. It's what keeps
Right.
makes the world turn. How do you see that undercutting what's happening, or how do you see that being impacted? Do you have hope that element at least is going to find its way despite the challenges being thrown at it?
Yeah, I think that's well put, Kevin. That and there sports, like, it's almost become cliche. It brings people together. It makes those connections. But there's something more fundamental there, where I think it reminds us of our shared humanity. And the outcome is the outcome of the game. We kind of all have our facts. We all have our news. We all have our content sources of information. But what happens between Argentina and France is what happens. And so, and as a result, that, like, they're going to have those moments in the World Cup that'll be watched billions of times. And I do think that, whether you call it diplomacy, whether you call it the people to people connection, that's going to happen regardless of the policies. There's a lot of negativity. There's a lot of kind of rancor on both sides in this current environment and around our current interactions. But I'm really excited for the opportunities that are going to, like, politics, our political environment can't stop, right? The fact that the Senegalese team or Cabo Verde is going to come, they're going to be in their first World Cup, or Curacao, like some of these Cinderella stories that are so intrinsic in sports, like, these are going to come out. And for a moment, it won't solve everything, but for a moment, for a time, it will unite us in a way that literally nothing else can. And so I'm very excited about that. And then from there, it's like, maybe there's some inflection points. Maybe there's a turning point where it's like, oof, this event was tough, but we had some really wonderful moments. Let's really rethink this now. I'm hoping that we have leaders that come out of these events and say, like, look, we have so many other opportunities to come. We have the World Military Games in 27. We have the Olympics in 28. It goes on and on. The University Games in 29. Rugby, men's and women's World Cup. We're going to have FIFA back here most likely in 31 for the Women's World Cup. Like, okay, we've seen it now. We get it. And maybe this is a path that we can start to look forward and transcend some of these divides. It's too easy to find the things that divide us. Is there a way that we can use this space to work towards things that bring us together?
Well said, and bonus points for pronouncing Curacao right. Better than Gretzky.
That was rough. Oh man, you got to have those pronunciation cards.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll second everything you say and add that I think beyond the people connections, it's the business, it's technology, it's these capabilities again. I mean, we didn't even talk about things like AI and
Right.
manufacturing and supply chains, human performance. You mentioned that as that's one area that I bring up often, where the military is really interested to know how Formula One drivers recover when they hit the wall.
Yeah.
And these are areas with the most elite of our elite, whether they're engineers or any other area. And so I really think, coming from the world of national security and national security academia and thought, I just came from a giant security conference where there wasn't anything about sport. None of them
Right.
do. But I've talked to all of them, and they all go, "Oh yeah, we kind of should have, or we wanted to." Or
Yeah, you have those light bulb moments with people when you have this conversation and kind of lay it out. Like, think about all the
yeah,
connection points, and it's just like, oh yeah, it's a great point. And we
so
have to keep banging that drum.
yeah, absolutely. Well, we're banging the drum together, man, and I'm glad to talk to you. Good luck with what you're
Thanks,
doing.
Kevin.
I'm sure I'll see you at the next shindig around town, if not anywhere else. And if you're watching us or listening, definitely go look up Jetr Global Sports and Entertainment. Look up Travis Murphy and what they're doing. They really are one of one, and I'm hopeful that they'll have all the success coming their way for all of our sake. And man, can't wait for World Cup and everything else. Thanks, Travis.
Likewise, appreciate you, Kevin. Thank you.